go down the row. Fred will comment on the paper, as will Kyle, and then Steve will give his thoughts as well. Dr. Fred Sautet is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center, as well as editor of the Mercatus Policy Series. He's up here. And he's co-author of Montenegro, Challenges of a Newborn State. Prior to joining Mercatus, Fred was senior economist at the New Zealand Commerce Commission and senior analyst at the New Zealand Treasury. Going right down the row is Kyle McKenzie. He is a research fellow here at the Mercatus Center and co-author of the Montenegro installment of the Mercatus Policy Series. Prior to joining Mercatus, Kyle was a Charles G. Koch Fellow at the Institute for Humane Studies. He also holds undergraduate degrees in psychology and economics from Beloit College. And today is his birthday. And last but certainly not least is Dr. Steve Pejovich. Steve is joining us as a visiting scholar this week. And for those of you who don't know, the Social Change Project's Visiting Scholar Program is a program that allows leading institutional specialists like Dr. Pejovich to spend up to 1 month at the Mercatus Center interacting with Mercatus and George Mason scholars to bring their ideas to policymakers on Capitol Hill, as well as to spend time in an intellectually stimulating environment. And we've very much enjoyed having Steve. Dr. Pejovich is an Emeritus Professor of Economics at Texas A&M University. And this afternoon he brings not just his economic expertise, but also his first-hand knowledge of Montenegro, since that's where he's from. So without any further ado, I'll hand it off to Fred.
Thanks a lot, Rob. My role here is basically going to be to set the stage for Steve to talk about what he thinks are the main issues in transition economies and Montenegro and so on. So in case you don't know, but pretty much everyone in the room is familiar with what we do. When was that? February 2007, we published this paper that's part of the Country Brief series. I'm the editor of this, so that's why I also publish myself in this, which is very convenient. The Montenegro study is also an exercise in armchair economics. I've never been to Montenegro. Kyle has never been to Montenegro. But we still say very interesting things about Montenegro, and that's mostly because Maja Drakic, our co-author, is from Montenegro. And, we brought the theory basically to bear to illuminate the facts, as Pete would say. And I think we have had quite a good number of downloads, and people have reacted quite well to it. But probably Steve will tell us whether or not he thinks it's true. So I'll just make a few remarks with regard to what I see the challenges are for Montenegro and or more generally for countries in transition in Eastern Europe. And Kyle will give us a little bit of more details as to what we exactly explain or what findings we have in the country brief. The first thing I would say, and that's actually something that my colleague Drago should always emphasize, is that when you talk about Eastern Europe, you shouldn't lump together all the countries. It's actually the same for countries in South America. Americans, as in from the U.S., people from the U.S. often say, well, South America, they have a bunch of problems there, or they have a bunch of whatever. And actually, all the South American countries are all very different from one another, and that's how they see themselves. And it's pretty much the same as far as Eastern Europe is concerned. Countries in the northern part of Eastern Europe are very different from those in the southern part and the central part, and so on and so forth. And so the case of the ex-Yugoslavia and Montenegro and Serbia are different from what is up north with, say, Estonia or Poland and so on. So they have all followed different transition paths, and they all have different cultural issues and attitude and so on. And this is very important to keep in mind. This being said, it is also important to realize that there are a similar set of problems, and that's what we want to reflect on when we look at transitioning problems and what has happened since the fall of communism. When I think of the problems of transition, and there are many issues that come to mind, but because I have been a good student of Pete, there are two things that come to my mind and that I would like to emphasize here and put on the table so that Steve can reflect on that. And the first one is it's all a problem of ideas and belief systems and what beliefs are floating around and how ideas are diffused. And the second one is it's a problem of commitment to reform and how countries can commit to a set of reforms or not. As far as so the first one is concerned, the ideas. You probably all know that the former Prime Minister of Estonia read Free to Choose and thought this was orthodoxy in economics and just went on and implemented that. I guess we all wish that every Prime Minister in every Eastern European country had done the same, but obviously that did not happen this way. And basically when communism fell in 1989, what was there was the field was littered with collapsed economies and utterly corrupt governments. But what was missing really was a set of ideas for the alternative. And as you probably remember, economists in those days really were all excited and thought, well, as long as we free up prices and we have, property rights that are enforced on paper, it's going to work fine. And Jeffrey Sachs was one of them. And it didn't work fine at all because actually the ideas that were necessary to make all those institutional change stick were not really diffused or were not really part of what the general population believed. So, and this is something we have found in Montenegro, and I'll get back to this in a second. This is such a big issue, actually, that I'm believing myself more and more that the whole mechanism of reform, of the reform process, be it in the West with New Zealand, for instance, or in the East, has a tremendous amount to do with belief systems and how they are and what type of biases people hold. And of course, that refers to our colleague Brian Kaplan in his recent book on voters and biases. I think you all know that Dragos has done some work on the diffusion of ideas, and I think this is really the type of stuff we should look at more. As far as the commitment to reform is concerned, I always like to use the examples one more time of Pete Batke, where he talks about the Russian case in the early 1990s when Viktor Garashenko was the head of the central bank. In 1992, he announced that the central bank would be following very strict monetary policy. This was the new liberal, as in the European sense, liberal policy that Russia would adopt. And when you look at what happened in the facts in 1992, the US dollar, $1 was worth 180 rubles. In 1995, after 5 years of extremely strict monetary policy, the US dollar was worth 5,000 rubles. So there was, in the interim, massive inflation. There was absolutely no strict monetary policy. But still, what came out of this was two things. One, that it gave a pretty bad name to whatever is called liberal policies in Russia and in other Eastern European countries. And the second thing is that it made commitment to reform completely non-credible, because you can announce this and do something else and nobody will care. So that Russian example and what happened in Russia afterwards is maybe the most extreme case, but many small examples have happened all around Eastern Europe and in various ways, which is why throughout the 90s we saw people who were former communists being reelected on various platforms, and the whole thing went totally crazy because you were like, why are you guys reelecting those guys, even though they're telling you different stories? And well, among the reasons were those two main issues that I have mentioned. One of them, the diffusion of ideas, that we were very optimistic as to how the biases in favor of centralization and the unknown and of the alternative, we were very optimistic as to how this could go away. And the second one was how politicians, by and large, destroyed their commitments and were not able to commit for the long run. So, I mean, overall, I would say if we look at what recipes are important for Eastern Europe, I'd say transition is just the same as in some ways as the rest. The holy trinity of policy, as New Zealanders call it, is something we want to use. And the holy trinity of policy is a strict monetary policy, low taxes, and open trade. This is something that has to be followed, and Montenegro is a very good example from that perspective because they have kept that in mind from the start. And actually, I would like to emphasize that aspect. I think the recipes for success in Eastern Europe or in transitioning economies starts with monetary policy, which is why Russia really took the wrong path. And Montenegro is a very good example of, well, in spite of all the problems, in spite of the ideas and the commitment problems, we can look at a small country or at various other countries, it's not the only one, which have followed very interesting path. And that path generally starts with very strict monetary policy. Montenegro adopted the Deutschmark completely, Dutch markerized or whatever, and euroized later on in 2001 or 2. The Serbia, which also had, probably this, had experienced massive hyperinflation in the early 1990s, set up a currency board in 1997 and reduced its inflation below 4 or 5% in the span of 4 or 5 years. Other countries have done the same, Bulgaria and so on. So all these countries, in my mind, are in the right situation to move forward because that's how you create the platform through strict monetary policy for something else. But these are only necessary conditions. They're not sufficient. And the problem with the sufficient question, in my mind, is the belief system and how this evolves. And unfortunately, it's not clear how this is going to evolve. One of the things we see in Eastern Europe, and especially in Montenegro, is that what I would call the intergenerational battle of ideas, where you have, especially in ex-Yugoslavia, where you have the old generation that has lived under communism for long enough, people who are 45, 50 and above, who long for the moments when they had secure jobs and so on. And the young generation, which is totally excited about something, but they're not clear what that something is. And so that there is that battle that is taking place. And in my mind, this will be the crux between, achieving that reform or failing in the long run. But probably we'll have to come back, in 20 years to have a definite view. So I'll, after giving you a general overview, turn to Carl, my co-author, who will tell you more about this, and then Steve hopefully will tell us if we're completely off the mark or if we have said something meaningful. But there you go.
Thank you. Thanks, Fred. For the purposes of the talk today, I broke our paper down into two very simple categories. One, what is Montenegro doing right? And second, what does Montenegro have to work on? I assure you our paper is much more nuanced and complex than that. But for the purposes of this talk, I thought it was a good way to divide it. So what is Montenegro doing right? First, what should be realized is that a lot of the reforms that Montenegro has been putting through actually started before their independence while they were still part of Serbia, and that's remarkable in itself. There's only been a few other instances of that in history. One is Estonia in 1987, and I find that just amazing by itself. And the reforms have focused on an open economy, fostering an environment favorable to business enterprise, and attracting foreign investors. And so I'm going to go through some specific policies that Montenegro has been very impressive on. The first, as Fred mentioned, is monetary and banking reform. In late 1993, the inflation in Serbia and Montenegro was 3.5 trillion% inflation. That number, I can't really wrap my mind around it, but it seems pretty big to me. Around this, it was the longest period of hyperinflation in history. So because of this hyperinflation, informal currency markets developed. About 60% of transactions in Montenegro were using the Deutschmark. And then later in 1999, Montenegro officially adopted the Deutschmark as their currency, and then in 2002 they switched from the Deutschmark to the euro when the rest of Europe did as well. Interestingly, recently I read a Financial Times article in which the EU kind of scolded Montenegro for using the euro. They said it was illegal, but that they didn't plan to do anything about it because Montenegro will likely join the EU in the future. The next policy reforms that Montenegro has done well are their international trade reforms. Before 2002, Montenegro actually had exceptionally low tariffs, but when Montenegro signed a treaty or an agreement with Serbia called the USM, or the Union of Serbia and Montenegro, it required them to raise their tariffs from an average of 2.8% up to 6.1%, and this was seen as a backward step in Montenegro. But interestingly, they did not harmonize their tariffs on everything. They held out on a few specific things, especially food products. Also in 2004, Montenegro took the symbolic but also important step of submitting a separate claim to the World Trade Organization. And in 2005, before Montenegro became independent, the World Trade Organization recognized them as being independent. The third thing Montenegro seems to be doing well is their privatization steps. That took place in two phases. From 1996 to 1999, they used what was called insider privatization, which was state-owned companies sold their shares to employees at a discount. And the consensus on this phase was that it didn't work very well. People did not achieve the results that they were looking for. So from 1999 onward, they tried a completely different approach, which focused on mass voucher privatization, the international sale tenders, and auctions of company assets. This method of privatization led to a large jump in foreign direct investment, which was important for the growth of Montenegro. And also mass voucher privatization led to the creation of capital markets, which I'll talk a little bit later on. Next, Montenegro tried to make some progress in their business regulations. And in 2001, they passed a law that attempted to reduce the number of days to start a business. Right now, or in 2007, it took about 24 days to start a business and 15 procedures. This is actually well above the regional average. So they still have some progress to be made on that front. And also, I'm sure you all know, in 2008, or the doing business data for 2008 is out from the World Bank, and Montenegro's statistics have not changed dramatically, yet they've actually slipped in the rankings a few points because I think other countries have actually improved. And the last thing that is very impressive about the Montenegro policy changes was their tax reform. Starting in 2005, Montenegro started changing their tax structure to become an attractive business destination. So starting in 2005, Montenegro passed a single flat corporate tax of 9%, replacing their former system, which is a two-tiered system. This is one of the lowest rates in the region and also in the world, frankly. And then recently, after they became independent in 2006, the parliament approved a flat tax of 15% on income. So there's a personal income flat tax of 15%. But interestingly, they plan to decrease that percent to 9% by the year 2010. So starting at 15 now, working their way to 9% by 2010. This will effectively eliminate the wedge between the corporate tax and the income tax. And as you know, when the two are differing by percentage points, it can create income tax flight and avoidance. But so they're going to harmonize their income tax rate at 9% and also the corporate tax rate at 9%. So these are all very impressive reforms. Most of them took place while still part of Serbia, but Montenegro still has some things to work on. I'll go into those next. First, Montenegro seems to have some public finance problems. although they've been successful as well in this area. Montenegro has taken steps to be more fiscally responsible. For instance, right now they have a budget surplus of 3% of their GDP. However, public spending is still, relative to GDP, quite high, at an estimated 44.6% at the end of 2006. This large amount of public spending, some of it has been blamed on local government spending that hasn't kind of caught the wave of the changes that the national government has been making. But more realistically, the government in Montenegro still employs a large amount of people, and this large public spending probably comes from that. Also, they need to work on labor market reform, which Montenegro has been very reluctant to reform. Understandably, it's probably one of the hardest things to reform in a transitioning nation. They attempted to create some significant change in 2003 by passing a law, but nothing happened. Nothing significant happened. For instance, to fire an employee in Montenegro right now, you have to take some really significant steps. First, you have to try to find the employee another job. Second, you have to provide retraining for that employee. And if you can't do either of those two, then the third step is you have to pay that employee 6 months' wages if you cannot find them a job. So that has some serious, that's a serious barrier on not only firing an employee, but because of that, hiring an employee also becomes much more of a risky prospect. Third, the informal economy in Montenegro is quite large. Montenegro should be looking to move its informal economy towards its more formal economy, where production of property rights can be used to capture the gains from trade. And as mentioned before, the large informal economy is probably due to the onerous business regulations that are there right now. Montenegro should take steps to reduce those business regulations in order to move people from the informal economy to the formal economy. And last thing that Montenegro needs to work on, which Fred talked about quite a bit, is in a section we labeled in the paper, Legacies of the Past. This is a section I worked on a lot in the paper, and it talks about the stickiness of culture in developing and transitioning countries, about the de jure rules that seem to be changing quite rapidly in these countries, but if the de facto norms don't change as well, then not much progress will be made. The legacies of the socialist past are still very apparent in Montenegro, as can be seen by the difference between the younger and the older generations. This is also evident in that there has been a few labor strikes in Montenegro that the government has kind of conceded to the strike, and therefore the government is acquiescing ground that they could be making up. However, on this front, one possible success story is that the mass voucher privatization has been extremely successful in Montenegro. The goal was to include as many people as possible. In fact, 90% of the adult population used vouchers during this privatization scheme. It made privatization understandable and acceptable to most of the public. So kind of the chain of events was that the privatization created this structure of secure property rights that people felt comfortable with. This led to the development of capital markets, and I think that these two steps led to a change in the culture in Montenegro, at least for the younger generation, in understanding how these capital markets work. Just to mention briefly, also in the paper, we use the Estonia example for their labor law changes for suggestions where Montenegro can look to, and also New Zealand, their fiscal policy is another example of a successful example of somewhere where Montenegro can look. If you want to read those examples, please pick up our paper when we're done here. And the last section of the paper, we talk about the EU context for Montenegro, and we kind of took a step back and said, it seems like Montenegro is doing really well. They've had a long history of successful reforms, they seem to be continuing these successful reforms. So Montenegro should really think about joining the EU before they just jump on board. And so we said this, cautiously and stuff like that. But Fred was talking to Joan Blondell last week, who is the director of the IEA in London, and he is also a Montenegro expert, or at least very interested in the region and the country. And he said, well, even though people in Montenegro are really up on markets, they love them, they enjoy privatization, they enjoy these policy reforms going on, most of them still want to join the EU with its 120,000 pages of regulations and the supranational government and whatnot, for the sole reason that they want a visa to travel through Europe and to work wherever they want. So that's something we might have looked over while writing this piece, is the importance that people put on the ability to travel throughout, freely travel throughout Europe and the rest of the world. So that's an interesting story that we probably forget about quite often. So thanks for talking or listening to my specifics on the paper. Hopefully Professor Pejovich can react to what Fred and I said and enlighten us all on some interesting things.
Thank you. It's a little bit difficult for me to understand why people assume because I come from the region that I know a lot about the region. I never joined comparative economic associations, for example. And the talk I gave yesterday, those of you who were there yesterday, and after I finish talking today, you will know where my heart is. But I do have some specific knowledge of Montenegro that I want to share with you. And I do have some very specific remarks to make about transition in Eastern Europe, of which Montenegro, of course, is a part. Before I start, three things. One is that there is a young lady here who was chief economist in the National Bank of Montenegro, and now she's your PhD student, Dragana Ostojić. You should ask her about the numbers, not me. And second is that I do find it rather puzzling to talk about the Holy Trinity, where one of the requirements for transition was macro stability. Now, transition is about changing the entire institutional structure of the country. How on earth can you have macro stability? I mean, you are trying to destabilize the country, not to stabilize. You are creating new institutions whose outcome leading into unknown outcome. And yet, you put macro stability as one of your primary objectives. That shows you only how wrong some of the mainstream economic models could be. There is a story about Montenegro. What is Montenegro like? Well, there is a story that says it was a mid-August day, twice as hot as Arizona, and there was a Montenegrin riding on a donkey, holding an umbrella over his head, and 10 paces behind him, as tradition would require, was his wife walking, carrying 2 suitcases on her back. A neighbor came by and said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm taking my wife to hospital." That is a little bit of a story that gives you tells you about the male dominance in the country. The way I want to make my comments, I make them short because we want to talk to each other. I will say a few words about the numbers and indexes in general. Then I want to talk about reforms, but of 2 different types of reforms. Those that come from above that we have observed, and those that are happening from below that only Montenegro, as far as I know, is happening only in Montenegro, as far as I know. Then I would like to relate reforms to, and the result of reform, to the 2 factors. One is the culture, another is the age distribution of the population. And finally, I think I would like to mention some important constraints on economic reforms in Montenegro, 3 of them at least: European Union, relations with Serbia, and ethnic composition of the country. All right. First, about numbers. I think it's wrong to judge the results of transition by looking at, for example, the rate of growth. Suppose now that Peter has $100,000 income, and he has a choice between spending it on wine and women or investing 5 in the bank and get 5% growth. If he spends on wine and women, and he chooses to do so voluntarily, his wealth will not grow. But suppose now the government comes along and says we need growth. And he has to put money into a growth project. So next year his wealth will be higher. But is he better off? No, he's worse off. Because he's been denied the most fundamental right to make subjective decision, to pursue his subjective preference. So when I talk about reform and the success of reform, my question is, are they putting in place institutions that are going to encourage voluntary interactions? And I think, to me, it's a much more important question than the question of what are the results of, quantitative results of reforms. And how wrong, how doubtful actually the results, quantitative results could be. Look at 2 major indexes for this year, Fraser and Heritage Foundation. Fraser, for example, can you tell this one? Number 60, look, can you just make, how do you make it that people can read? Stronger. Yeah. Now, if you look number 60 down, it's Montenegro. Montenegro is rated 60 out of 141 countries. If you look upstairs, you see Croatia 82, ahead of Slovenia, and you see Slovenia is 91. So you have Croatia ahead of Slovenia, and Montenegro is number 60. That is, I'm not exaggerating, ridiculous. It's not 60 as free country in the world. Now, if you look at the same index for this year from the Heritage Foundation, they don't even rank Montenegro and Serbia. They are nowhere to be seen. Not yet. They will next year. But Croatia is way down. It's 109, very at the end. And Slovenia is way up relative to Croatia. Slovenia is 58 and the rank because the numbers on the left. And Croatia is 109. Now, that's a huge difference. So I wrote to Professor Guardi, who does index for Fraser, and I asked him, I said, how could you do that? And the strange thing happened. Maybe not strange, predictable. You know, when you develop your own child, your own project, you come to the point at which you are more interested in defending what you have rather than trying to argue how to make it better. You know? So I was getting all sorts of arguments. He said, do you really think that we don't know how to calculate? Of course you calculate right, but what's wrong with, something has to be wrong with the methodology there. You know? Well, we couldn't reconcile it. I mean, he was not interested. He was interested in telling me that he is right. But I don't think so. Now, on reforms. If people, in 1991, people really, 88, 99, people really believe that it's a technical issue. And it's a technical issue, all you have to do is to enact proper institutions, and then things will happen the way they're happening in the rest of the world. I remember a professor, who is a very good friend of Pete and myself, but I won't mention the name because he's a very good friend of ours, who told me at the meeting in 1991, he said, all the Russians need is 5 minutes and they are all going to be entrepreneurs. And I said, look, in the United States, we've been waiting for 2 years. Not everybody is an entrepreneur. It does not work that way. There are some other facts that are important. The question, what are those facts? I would like to mention two things that about economic reforms from above in the report. One is that you make a new law. What is the really consequence of that law? It creates new or modifies the existing opportunities for exchange in the use of resources. But the effect of that law and the outcome depends on what? How those new opportunities are perceived by the prevailing culture, by the community as a whole. And how they are perceived by the community depends on the community's culture and other institutions which are part of the system. So what outcome that you observe is not result of that new law. It's a joint product of the new law and the reaction to that law by the existing institutional system. It's the same like in price theory when you say you add another worker to your team. The output will change, but the change in output is not the result of the working of that one worker. It's a common outcome of adding one more worker, in this case one more law, into the system. And therefore the reaction of the system to a new law is important. Now, what I have done, and I will show you now, again today I think to be in the position of paying compliments to one of your intellectual leaders, but I wrote a paper. It was a draft that Peter, liked, that he brought me here to some meetings you had, and I developed the paper. It became really good paper. I sent to him to read. He overlooked it, and I published it. You remember that? Yeah. When I talked, he said, "Why did you tell me? Why did you wait? I didn't want to wait. Why should I wait? Given my age, I never know can I wait or not." It's not clear. So, what I did, I took all East European countries, and I look, and I said, like, this, for 500 years, these regions have been subject to 3 empires and 3 major religions. 3 empires being Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Turkish, and Russian. And 3 major religions, Islam, Roman Catholic, Protestant too, and Eastern Orthodox. So I said, if culture does matter, then I said there must be some difference in the results of the way people reacted to free market reforms in Eastern Europe. And then I divided the countries into those 3 groups. Actually, I divided them in 2 groups. Those subject to Western influence and those that were not subject to, those that were subject to Turkish and Russian rule. And then again I looked, the transition is not the event, it's a process. So I look at the results in 1996 and in 2006. And I took heritage index, which I really think, and you may have got sense from this, that I think is more accurate and better done. And I have a subjective reason. Ed Follner and I were graduate students together one time in Georgetown. I believe in subjectivism very much. Can you? It's a very long, so let me first, here is the Western influence. Countries that have greater Western influence. Every country has improved between 1996 and 2006. They all improved their index, because in the heritage index 5 is the worst, 1 is the best. They all did better. They moved from 3.3 average, which is mostly unfree, to 2.3, which is mostly free. Now, if you look at the other countries, they're subject to the Western, to the lesser Western influence, they still remain in mostly unfree category after 2006. They moved from 3.59 to 3.17. And Serbia and Montenegro were not ranked. So there was definitely a difference in the effect of reforms between countries that had some memories of the rule of law and the countries that never had those memories. When I said memories of the rule of law, this is what I mean. Of course, this comes straight from Hayek and Bruno Leoni. And you see how carefully they put democratic elections at the end. Because unless the term constitution comes first, and then democracy, you are most likely to have one man, one vote, one time. You know? Now, I think that one example I will give you, and I tell you, go to the second reason for why reforms have not done well. There was a beer brewery in Montenegro, which is quite well known world over. They won gold prize in London several times. And it was bought by a foreign investor, I think from Belgium. The local government in the old Yugoslavia, local government and the workers, in effect, jointly controlled the firm. Of course, under the umbrella of the party. And those habits have remained. So what happened now, even though the workers were paid about 50%, I'm told, more than the average salary in Montenegro, they started asking for things they were used to from the old days. Travel abroad, subsidized housing, another salary, a car for the members of the for workers' leaders, company car. Well, the company got sick and tired and said, we are going to close down the place. That story is not important. The important thing is what happened now. What did they say? They said, you did not build a factory, you have no right to close it down. Hey, that's the respect for property rights. That's the understanding of property rights. It was the firm bought the company. Now they told them, you didn't build it, you have no right to close it down. Now, if you have to face this kind of a culture, this kind of understanding, you simply cannot reform the country by enacting rules and regulations that we associate with free exchange. The second reason that I think is equally important, and I show you the outcome on another. You have many people, you have two groups of people, in my opinion, in Eastern Europe at the time of change. People who were 45 years old and older, and the younger people. The older people really remember good old days before communism. And they had better memories of the past than the young people. But all they had, all assets they had, were those provided by the communist regime. A pension, subsidized vacations, subsidized housing, few things that go with the general welfare program. Now, what happened when we had a big reforms in 1993, Washington Consensus, Jeffrey Hughes? All those assets were wiped out. Pension became next to nothing in terms of monetary value. And all other things simply disappear in thin air. They were too old to create new portfolio of wealth. All they had is so regardless, but the young people, on the other hand, had time to work and create in a new environment. To them, the cost of change was much less than to the old people. And those people, regardless of how they felt about communism, they now went to vote for socialist parties to come back, because why? They wanted back their assets. And indeed, within a few years, the socialist parties came back to power through free elections. Now, I'm sorry for some of you who saw me yesterday that I'm showing the same slides, but here is what happened, the final result. Even when, turn it on, please, because it's like, it's not enough just to look at the index as a whole, because index has 9 categories, heritage index, I believe 9, now 11. It's important to pull out those that we associate with the rule of law, which I just had here, that are really the best testament of how the rule of law has succeeded in Eastern Europe. And that I will say there are 2 categories that are very important to private property rights and public and government regulations, because they really tell us about how much of voluntary exchange they have, and also how much respect they have for private property rights. And this is now what happened in Eastern Europe. If you look down at the bottom, averages, in 2005, the total index, the average was 2.8 compared to 3.3 in 96. So by any measure, general measure, the countries are much freer now. They are closer to free market than they were in 1996. But look now at property rights and regulations. 3.3 in 05 as compared to 2.9 in 96. They are worse off. Property rights are worse off than in 96. And in terms of regulations, from 3, remember, 1 is the best, 5 is the worst. They went from 3.1 to 3.4. Again, it's worse. So I feel comfortable saying that economic reforms, given the expectations we created in 1991, have not been successful. Now, three things that I think are worth mentioning because they specifically affect Montenegro is European Union. What Blondell said is true, but I don't fully agree. I think I would like to ask public choice question. Who supports European Union? You will find out that the bureaucracy, the ruling elite loves, in every country, they support European Union. Why? They get free trips to Brussels, they get appointments in Brussels, they stay there for 3 years, at fabulous salaries, they go back, they have pensions. They love it. So they have every conceivable reason to convince people that's a good thing. And to tell Montenegrins you can travel, I mean, first of all, it's not free good to travel. You can get passport, you have to pay for it. Who else supports in Eastern Europe? Academics. Go to the city of Turin, where Colombato has his center. Next to his center is a big building housing young people who come on various grants from EU. And you look at what kind of project they have. You will never see the project that says, what's wrong with EU? They all have projects how to make it look better, how to make a good thing look even better. So you're developing a specific human capital which tolerates no opposition to the institution they have, to the organization. And the young people from Montenegro would like to get grants to go to Europe. And to get grants, they have to write proposals which are favorable to EU. So academics like EU. Ordinary people hear about subsidies. And I believe that the EU is becoming really an organization that has one fundamental purpose: to prevent stagnating economies of Western Europe, of all Europe, from more dynamic economies in the East. Serbia's relations with Montenegro has very specific relations with Serbia, which cannot be ignored. The Serbs believe, and I'm half Serb, half Montenegrin, Serbs do believe that Montenegrins are Serbs, and therefore they have betrayed the country by separating. It's a conviction that's built in. Even people who will be telling you, all right, it's okay. For example, a colleague of mine said, it's all right for them to leave. I said, what right do you have even to say? They have, it's okay, we let them leave. Who are you? Are they going to let you leave? The other way around. They never think that way. But the relations are very serious. There are about more Montenegrins in Belgrade than in Podgorica. That's not a small problem. And those people don't know whose citizens they are. Religion is the same. History is the same. There were few leaders in Montenegro who always talk about Serbia being part of that Montenegro is part of Serbia. So that relationship, that separation between Serbia and Montenegro is not event, a referendum, and that's over. I think it's going to take a long time before it becomes a reality in the minds of the people. And the final point about ethnicity. About 20%, maybe more people in Montenegro are either Albanians or Muslims. And I was told that ethnic relations are quite good in Montenegro compared to that in Serbia or Croatia. Then when I taught 2 years ago, I spent 5 weeks in Montenegro. I asked how many professors at the University of Podgorica are Albanians or Muslims. None. I asked how many students are Albanians or Muslims. There were few. I could, if I was a Muslim or Albanian in Montenegro, I would have some serious doubt about me being equal or having equal opportunity. And I think that's a problem that may not be very immediate problem, but it's a problem that I think Montenegro will have to work to deal with before too long. I had one of my students, second best in class, was an Albanian girl, and I went to Petar Ivanović, her Dragana's friend. I said, this girl should get a good job. Please, for God's sake, give her. I was told that 1 year she got 2 promotions. They have to. This is something that has to be done if Montenegro is to become a truly independent state. What kind of future I want for the country? I think they should not join EU. They should become a Macau or a smuggling community, because European Union has so many regulations. There is so much to be gained, so much money to be made by smuggling things in. So the small Montenegro, 600,000 people, right at the edge of Europe, they could become the richest group. And Monte Carlo, Macau, just create a beautiful smuggling community, break those, send it. Recently they have passed the rule in European Union that farmers cannot feed their pigs with food left over on their table. They have also made the rule that cucumbers have to be of certain size and shape. Imagine how, if you sell cucumbers that are a bit smaller for half the price, you can get rich. So they could gain, I think they could really gain much more by becoming a sort of a pyramid. Who wrote a book about pyramids? They should read your book. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pejovich. That was fantastic. Let's open up the questions.
One of the things that I found very fascinating in your discussion was the demographics and the incentives. So that what you have is, if I understood you correctly, we have 2 populations. We can divide the population into 2 pools. One pool is 45 and older who have some memory of pre-communism, but their pensions and their assets are all tied up with the old system. And then the other group, which has no knowledge of capitalism, of its working thing, but they have lower cost of engaging in the transition. So what you have is you have a kind of cultural bankruptcy on the side that would be in favor of the transition. And then you have, even if they have a residue of legitimacy of capitalism, it's against their interests. And so as a result, you have that. And so, I mean, I think that's fascinating because you know, normally when people talk about cultural issues, they try to juxtapose culture with sort of standard economic arguments. And the way I see you as putting those things is actually relating them right to one another. And I was wondering if you have thought any more about ways in which we can, in fact, figure out or jiggy to lower the transaction costs.
I'm sorry, I'm looking for Steve Gordon. I'm sorry.
No, I can't. That's a challenging question. I have not done more work beyond what I just said.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. How do you reduce transaction costs for those people? I don't know. But that's a real issue. That if you look very carefully, for example, who bought socialists now? But all the people. The people who know more than young people how bad the system was.
Yeah. Did you ever see the little book by Jan Wieniawski?
Yes.
In which he goes through and he figures out the dollar amounts it would be required.
I did not
it's
see
a very
that
fascinating thing.
I have not seen
He
that.
figures out the dollar amounts in Poland that you would have to pay the people who benefit from the system so that they could get the present value of the future incomes.
I never seen, but I heard about it.
And it's less than any amount of money that we've given them, you know, I mean, in foreign aid or any kind of thing like that. And he says we would do much better if we just did that and said, you know, go and retire and, you know, and do that and then we'll work on this other thing. And it's kind of like a Tulloch. I mean, the question that you're raising is, you know, the $64 million or $1 billion question because it's Tulloch's transitional gains trap.
Yes.
But just applied general to the transition issues. So.
I cannot see yes, but I heard about it. You know. Before you ask question, the same problem is in Kosovo. At one time, Serbs in Kosovo, who were only about 10%, Albanians were very willing to pay above the market price for their property. And they could have gotten the money, went to Germany, and lived happily ever after. But the politicians told them the Kosovo is part of Serbia. It's our bit, you know. And now those people have left their homes penniless. They lost their property, and the Kosovo is going to be gone anyway. Yeah.
This goes to the question of pensions as assets. Assets have future assets have future values, and the loss of pensions is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not simply Eastern European countries or it's happening in the United States.
But that's true. But they saw their situation. They saw that they associate loss of their pension with their reforms.
Yeah.
That's a perception. People act on the perception, not on the truth. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it goes to Peter's question. The solution might be just to give them some, you know, to give them some money and say retire, and then to resolve the perception. Because in the United States, you know, the amount, for example, in the state of Virginia, the amount of money that's actually there for pensions is you know, maybe 40% at most, because most of it is not investment. Most of it's land and things like that with no liquidity. So the solution might be closer to Peter's. You know, just give them some money.
In Yugoslavia, it was not property because property belongs to the state. It was really
the promise. A pension's a promise. It's not a contract.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, no, just
I cannot hear you.
Two quick sort of thoughts on what you said, just reactions to what you said. But there's a Antiguan author who, when she talks about the resistance to capitalism in Antigua, said, well, it makes sense that we resist capitalism because for so long we were capital, right? And that made me think of it connected to your work and it's sort of the damage done to capitalism by people working on its behalf. Like, you know,
very true. Very true. Yeah.
It seems like a real challenge and a burden that people now have to earn in order to move towards capitalism. The second thing that you said, though, when you talked about this sort of cultural bankruptcy, the way people cultural bankruptcy of people who low-cost movers to flea markets, and then the sort of interest burden of the people who would have the cultural legacy that support it is, and sort of that being a challenge to transition. I wonder also how much that should temper our celebration of any place like Montenegro, whoever who seem to have managed to get there, to be on their way towards it, because you would expect in that kind of situation to see retreats from sort of any of these moves towards capitalism and free markets and what have you. Under those kinds of circumstances, without the sort of cultural foundation, you would expect to be short-lived. And so, does that, to me, that seems to suggest that we should temper even ourselves when we say, oh, look how close towards, this move towards free markets has been in this or that country that doesn't have the cultural foundation, that we should temper that kind of celebration of that as well. I wonder what your thoughts on both those.
That has something to do with the question you raised about Africa yesterday, of course. And I have left this out, and I will answer your question now in the way I should have done it in my talk. I said there is another way for reforms to work from below, and I said that only, as far as I know, only Montenegro has chosen that way. And we can think of something like that in the United States happened. So before I talk about how it's done in Montenegro, let me go to the 1950 America. In 1950, at least I know when I arrived here, capitalism was on the run. Case was in, and monetary policy was out. Free market was out. And then there were two institutions, I would say, perhaps more, but two that I experienced, who changed it from below. One was called Earhart Foundation, Richard Baer, another University of Chicago School of Economics. What Dick Ware did, he simply invested little money he had into young people who held some belief in free market and who held intellectual promise of doing something with it. And he told me many times, I don't care about proposal you people make. I bet on people. And he has created a number of people. He has really created a generation of people who would not have been scholars today if it was not for his help. On the other hand, Chicago School, Milton Friedman, unlike Hayek, Milton Friedman was able to reach the median voter. And that has made a difference. So what's happening now? Similar thing, it was investment in human capital that I call, that brought things. Today, Liberty Fund is doing the same thing. Institute of Humane Studies might have done it, I know little about that. I think in Montenegro, people talk about taxes, foreign direct investment, but to my mind, the most important thing is the development of the new school in Montenegro, which is strictly Austrian School of Economics. Professor Vukotic has already trained, I believe, 5 or 6 generations of people who went through the program that was exclusively, like Francisco Marroquin in Guatemala, where you teach free market, you teach Friedman. He does not make distinction between Friedman and Hayek, he loves them both. And those people there is a core of young people that she is part of, Dragana, core of young people there who understand the working of the market, who do understand the basic principle of liberty, and who already have a great deal of influence through the various agencies, including Ministry of Finance. Those are people who, through their work, through their success, through their persistence, could change, affect, reach the median voter that Friedman did at one time. Professor Vukotic has now invested. How did he get money? A man without means in the Balkans got money. He got somehow money to build a new school. So he resigned from the university where he had his program. He's now independent. He brought these young people he brought up with him to teach. So who is teaching at his school? People who learn, who got a degree by learning, reading Hayek and Friedman. And he also has a people, Henry Manny went there to teach. Colombato is going there every year to teach. Blondell went to teach. I don't know if you have made it, but you will, I believe me, if I have anything to do with it. And this, I think, that is how you change the culture. But it has to take a long time. It does not happen big bang. Right. And this is, now Friedman and Dick Ware had one advantage over Vukotic. Because the culture they wanted to get back to had its root in America. They had simply to remind people of, hey, remember, this is our tradition. What Vukotic has to do in Montenegro is to tell them, forget about your tradition. We got to go to something new, something different. It's a more difficult job, but that's the way to go, through investing in young people, through education, which is very solid, reputable, and at the level. And I think that's what Bauer was talking one time when he talked about Africa. Let tribal leaders be in charge and let young people simply go to good schools. I talk too much.
You mentioned in the 1950s in the United States, one of the intellectual battles was between John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a Keynesian, and Friedman. They both had television programs. And,
not in the 1950s, it was later,
no,
was it?
It was later than the 60s when they
but in the 50s
the intellectual battles, I mean, in terms of their writings, was in the 40 and 50 intellectual battles, and you know, Keynes, I mean, Galbraith thought that in the affluent society we just make enough money and we can, you know, have a better social justice and things like that, and it was the results that torpedoed Galbraith, and the results that boosted freedom.
But I think that the debate, I mean, this is not the point I wanted to make, but just on that, you know, it's interesting because the debate at that time was a little cleaner in a weird way, because it's not like Galbraith was arguing to defend the capitalist system. He was arguing that the system has to, there is a substitution in the system. The problem that you raised before is the damage that's been done to capitalism by people claiming to promote capitalism.
Yeah,
that's our new challenge. So we have now, you know, since World War II, a whole history of foreign aid, you know, programs, a whole history of transition economics now, which is 20 years old, in which people in the West have been saying that they're promoting, you know, the development of capitalism, and it has generated some results which people in these countries find rather upsetting. And I think the debate is one that's quite fascinating because you have to sort out so many things. So Naomi Klein has this new book out, and she claims in there basically capitalism is the result of, you know, deprivation, disease, whatever, you know, anything possible is a consequence of capitalism. And she tries to link Friedman with Pinochet and does all these things which, you know, would require a step-by-step defeating of her position in order to then, you know, get her to be back into like, you know, she needs like a shock, you know, kind of thing, to get her sort of back into reality, because she has this whole story built up. But the problem is a lot of people buy into it. And so I think that that's, you know, one of the issues at stake. And the other issue is, Fred can speak to this. Actually, three issues. Fred can speak to this because New Zealand went through it. They got their reforms, but their culture is still don't, you know, cut down the tall poppy. And so as a result, they get backtracking. Remember, Fred was gonna be leading a major project here, and we got caught up in other things on OECD countries and backtracking, where they've made reforms because of Milton Friedman and the post-Keynesian's the wrong word, but the after Keynes kind of revolution, but then the slow backtracking back to what Friedman himself referred to as creeping liberalism. Mm-hmm. So we had galloping socialism, and now we have creeping liberalism, and that backtracking, I think. And then the final thing is actually the book that you're working on with Anthony, which is all about the transmission of ideas.
What's the book?
Actually, is an illustration of the point made by Peter. We are looking at the way Western economics diffused in Eastern Europe as a sort of either precondition or the sort of parallel phenomenon with structural changes, with the transition.
Would you mind letting me know more about that? Could you write to me?
Oh, sure. And the findings are very interesting because, and are illustrating this.
Will you send me some of your findings?
Sure. We are very close to finishing the first draft of the book. And we are looking like 9 countries. Unfortunately, Serbia is not among those countries because we're unable to have a team gathering data because it's based on a network of researchers in the field gathering data and making interviews with the economists of those countries, and because of the war and things following that. But the idea is this, that on the one hand you have the literature pretending or claiming that there's a sort of neoliberal sweep in Eastern Europe and the most market fundamentalist guys are now in charge with the politics and the climate of opinions there. And then you have our results from the field which show that at best you have a sort of 50s or 60s neoclassical synthesis dominating the field.
McConnell.
Yes.
Not Elchin.
So it's striking that people are, even people not like Naomi Klein, but people that should know better, still use the case of Eastern Europe as a showcase of the madness of the neoliberal reforms, market fundamentalism, and things like that. The empirical, very concrete findings.
Please write to me. Claire has my email address.
Sure. Yeah,
She
sure.
can, I don't have the card, business card.
And part of, and it's interesting because part of our study, we want to look at what should be the most extreme for market position, and we look at the case of the Austrian economics in various countries. And what we discover is indeed there are strong communities, but they are in no way dominating the public discourse, they are in no way dominating the politics of those countries, and they are in no way dominating the academia.
Alice Amstead and Lance Taylor wrote a book in the mid-1990s called Has the Market Met Its Match? I recommend that you look at it. It's hilarious because one of the things that they claim in the book is that Eastern Europe and also the Washington Consensus reflects the ascendancy of Mises, they even got the name right, of Mises and Hayek, and that all the economists who are now dominating the international scene are followers of these two oddballs, Mises and Hayek. And I remember one of my comments on the footnote to that was, I haven't seen the resources, I mean, if that's the case, I should be the one that gets to go to Russia and drive around in the ZIL rather than Jeffrey Sachs, right? And all that kind of stuff. Oh, we're actually on TV. I shouldn't be saying stuff like that. But, it's kind of a weird thing because their perception of reality, and I think this is like also the reason why Naomi Klein is the most extreme form of it, but her perception of the reality is that, somehow, Milton Friedman and other people were sitting there like rubbing their hands saying, how can I get really rich and bankrupt these countries when they have misfortune, and I'm going to go in there and get really rich, and that's like her vision of the world. And somehow that's laissez-faire capitalism. And it's like a bizarre kind of position, but Virgil's right. What was the comment about in Antigua, right? Was we used to be capital. Yeah. And that's a hard challenge. You have to defeat that with history and economics and politics and the Institute for Human Studies.
I'm wondering if Robert Rubin.
I really, but Austrian economics has much more to recommend in terms of depth and freedom than Chicago School. But Chicago School was better at reaching the median voter.
Yeah.
It simply did much more for us in a way than we did for ourselves.
I was wondering if Robert Rubin was one of those people who tried to push capitalism with structural adjustment programs and getting the IMF and the Washington Consensus, and just being unsuccessful because of insensitive to culture and as somebody just said, Latin America, these countries are quite different in their receptivity.
Well, it's a very strange thing because guys like Stiglitz, he wants to, a lot of these people, Sachs, Stiglitz, all of them, they want to at some point not be held responsible, right? And so they actually make an argument that they were outsiders. But when you look at it, they were actually the guys there. So it's a very kind of, it's a very strange strategic vision that they pulled.
They have created the basic mythology about the neoliberal moment.
Yeah.
And the empirical research, and they are doing very concrete empirical research in Eastern Europe precisely to knock out these kind of phony arguments based on nothing else other than their subjective impressions or the strategies they want to project. Show very clear that actually the kind of claims empirically that they are making about the diffusion of Western economic ideas in Eastern Europe are bogus. There is no such empirical. And now we had interviews, probably hundreds of economists in Eastern Europe, hundreds. I'm not talking here. I'm talking 9 countries, at least 15 to 20 interviews with economists per country. So it's not like.
Can I now impose on you, Dragana, because you were chief economist for the National Bank. You heard the presentation here. You probably are more at home with what's happening there than all of us together. What's your reaction to what happened today? What was said today?
No, first, I wanted at the end to give a few comments. First, I wanted to thank the authors that is not here, at least to making some things more known about Montenegro beside the commercial and popular culture that you can see from movies. The study laid out, let's say, if we're just speaking about reforms, and I'm now referring to completely technical side, those things that Steve spoke earlier, it's laid it out completely well. And those are the challenges, and I would add up something a bit more, if you go toward alignment to reform, it's judicial system, which is a huge obstacle to do anything else, because no matter what you do right, it's very easy to write good laws, but how to implement them in the practice, making them work, that's pretty much the toughest part. And we have, let's say, quite good laws, but who respects them? And what happens if you can bribe a judge or a policeman for however it works for you? The things are not so dramatic as I'm telling, but they have been improving, but that's a minimal change. I wanted to refer also to things to what Steve told us, and first I wanted to thank you personally and use this occasion for all your visits to Montenegro and help to develop the school where I belong. And it's been actually now 8 generations of people and about 1,500 people. We are speaking about small country of 650,000, so potentially that's a huge impact for change. And about the challenges that are people facing, or even telling me be one of these young people and who had the chance to change something, it's not so easy when you work in an institution, no matter on how good ambitions you have and what you want. First, you have constraints from your colleague, and those are hard clashes, and whatever you want to change, it takes a time. And second, we deal with the people, with their emotions, with their problems, so that you lose lots of energy, and you have to take that into account. You cannot just hurt all the people and put your change. Nobody will accept it. So that's one really a tough part also to include, because you forget the individual. No matter how the core you have is good, it has to find the rest, and that's time-consuming process. It will take more and more time. Finally, there is one interesting thing which Steve mentioned. It's about culture and ethnicity. It's a big thing in the Balkans. Historically, it's a big thing. And me coming from Balkans also said, oh, it's really nice and fine. And me and Steve talk about this. How many Albanian professors you have? It's not, with the Muslims it's different because they count themselves either as Montenegrins, and you do have some professors, but there are no people at any, let's say, decision-making progress. There are no professors and so on. And then I asked, that opened my mind in thinking what's going on there. But you do not see any written obstacles, but obstacles are more within ethnical group and their incentives and their perception where they can get, because their ambitions are limited up to the level, and they would never even try to fight. There are rare examples is this girl, and also you had to go into this small ethnical group and fight them, to help them fight or realize, make them aware what they want and that they can achieve more even if they are in that country. So really it's still all the things are a bit locked in. And I don't know what to tell us, just thank
Well,
you for all of this.
what I would like you to remember, as I believe here, that there is one difference between Montenegro and the rest of Eastern Europe. There are 8 generations of people now who were trained exclusively in free market economics in a small country of 600,000 people. In the whole of Eastern Europe, you don't find that. And that's all because of one man, Vukotic.
Thank you everyone for coming. Have a good afternoon.